At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Dès ma première rencontre avec M. Nehru, Delhi et à Chandigarh,
how from being a totally dusty plain, Chandigarh is now covered with greenery.
City must grow. It must be given a direction.
Hello and welcome to the story of Chandigarh, a podcast about how the modernist city of Chandigarh came into being and what its future might look like. This is Ishan Shafla, and with me is Dr. Vikramaditya Prakash. In today's episode, we'll talk about the High Court, the first building to be constructed within the capital complex. We discuss its likeness to an umbrella, its weightlessness, and the experience of the uncanny. We also discuss the tapestries of the High Court, as well as Corbusier's flexible approach to executing his vision. So we've spoken previously about the capital complex and the siting of it within the city, but we haven't as yet gotten into the individual buildings. So let's go through them in the order of construction. So the first to come up was the High Court, and that was due to logistical reasons, you think, to accommodate the lawyers that were coming in?
Yes, all the judges had shifted to Shimla and the court was already operational. And I think once they shifted also to Chandigarh, they were operating out of somewhere, some makeshift building. So they were really desperate to get a building. That's why I think they decided to make the High Court first.
We talk about all these buildings in metaphorical terms often. The assembly is the bull and the secretariat is the cruise ship, let's say.
Ocean liner, yeah.
Ocean liner.
Yes.
But I wasn't aware of the metaphor for the High Court until I was reading your book, and you refer to it as an umbrella.
It is an umbrella.
Not as obvious as the other two, I mean, visually at least.
Maybe not, but the sort of visually, the basic design of the building is that it has a double roof, correct? That it's a rectilinear cuboid building, which is, the courts below. And then there are the arches, and then there is another roof on top.
Mm-hmm.
So when there is a second roof on top of the first roof, that obviously feels like an umbrella to me. So that's why I think of it as an umbrella. But then, I think it also connects to the shelter of the law. Right. So it's under the shelter of the law, but it's also, umbrella is also a very significant, has always been a significant symbol in Indic history. So Chhatra Chaya is the word, and then whenever royal kings and royalty are in the street, they are always covered with an umbrella because of the heat of the sun. And then when the old kings were buried, they or their ashes were cremated. So you see a stupa also has an umbrella coming out at the top, a Buddhist stupa. So when Ashoka made the first stupas and interred all of the Buddha's relics and remains in these mound, which he calls the stupa, there was a column which went all the way through the middle and came out in the top as an umbrella. And what he was doing was he was simply signifying that this mound, this stupa, has royal standing, because the Mauryan kings and the Shunga kings before that in the 3rd century BC also were, their relics were also, their ashes, their relics were also buried in these mounds with an umbrella coming out on top. So anyway, I think the idea of the second roof, which is, described pragmatically as a cooling device, because it shades the roof. It shades the roof and cools the building, which is definitely a passive solar cooling technique. But it only works in the South Asian or the really hot, dry, arid circumstances because it functions as an umbrella. But I also think it functions as an umbrella because, as you know, the roof collects water.
Water, and down the middle.
Down the middle.
So it's sloping inwards slightly.
It's sloping inwards. So now, of course, umbrellas slope outwards traditionally, but Corbusier sloped it inwards because he wanted to collect the waters and make these giant scuppers with the walls, water falling to the sides.
The double roof also contributes to its weightlessness, doesn't it? Because it adds to that structural ambiguity, because it looks like the arches are holding up the roof, but it's the other way around, isn't it?
Right. So there are several things you're talking about here, but first let's talk about the arches. It does look like the arches are holding up the roof or should be holding up the roof. But as you know, I don't know if our listeners know, the arches are actually hung from the roof. So the pylons of the wall come all the way up, and then there is the roof, which slopes inwards, and then the arches are hung down using iron suspenders. So, of course, traditionally arches hold up because arches are, the strongest possible form in the world, particularly when they're made out of brick. Mm-hmm. And I'm not 100% sure of this, but I'm 99% sure of this. Corbusier originally did want the roof to be held up by arches. So the arches were supposed to hold up the roofs. But the roof slopes inwards. So if the arches are very complex forms because they are larger, because they go from top to the bottom, they have to have a very particular form. So they are kind of, they're not hyperbolic paraboloids, but they have complex geometries. And the engineers couldn't do that. They just couldn't figure out how to make those arches structural. So instead they did what they knew how to do, which is they took the pylons all the way up, made a roof on top of that using reinforced concrete, and then faked it and put the arches down. So and this is an amazing thing. This was going on all the time. And I don't know what Corbusier thought about this. Because, in the Tagore Theatre, when my father, Aditya Prakash, also designed the roof, it was supposed to be a cross truss, a truss in both directions, one direction and then the other direction. Because on the roof, it goes in both directions, the steel, right? Right. But the engineers couldn't figure it out. So it's fake. So all the load is carried by trusses going in one direction only.
Sure.
And then they put the cross members just to make it look like a steel frame. So this whole business of, making a building look structural, whereas it isn't structural, was a thing that happened a lot in the early days of Chandigarh. I suppose it's still happening. Similarly, the Neelam cinema, which my father designed, if you look at the official section of the building, it has a continuous curve which goes through, right? But that's not how, but that's not how they actually built it. They only built the curves on the outside. On the inside, they just threw down trusses.
So that became a sort of recurring motif.
Recurring practice, that there was this thing that they could make it look structural. And I remember once reading somewhere, Corbusier had an argument where the engineers said, what is it? We'll make it look like you want it to look. And Corbusier was mad, and he was like, you don't understand. But I wonder what Pierre Genre thought about all this, because he was the actual supervising architect on the ground when all these buildings were being made. Mm-hmm. It's worth examining, the High Court, it would be worthwhile to go back and look at the original set of drawings that came from Paris and how it actually came out.
I know what you mean. At what point it changed into what it is.
That's right. I mean, that would be great detective work to do. Now, of course, the other thing that the arches do because of the fact that they dip down in the middle and they are higher on the other side is that they do compress the air, right? Mm-hmm. Because the High Court is oriented in the direction of the prevailing winds, northeast, southwest. So air blows in either one direction or the other. So the air, as it comes through, the hot air, let's say, as it comes through, is compressed and then is released, right? And that compressing and releasing, and now my physics is not 100% on this, is roughly how also air conditioners work. They compress and release. So it is supposed to also function as to cool the air.
Right, become thermodynamic.
Yeah. So, but I don't know how, again, if there were some science people, there was somebody, a Berkeley PhD or something, who used instruments and measured the actual performance of the buildings. But she only, I think, measured the performance of the brise soleil, the concrete frame solar shading system. She didn't, it'd be interesting to measure whether the air on one side or the other side, whether it actually works.
In that respect, this building is very unique because it seems to be engaging all of the elements, right? The sun and the wind and the rain.
That's right. So Corbusier was just like, I am going to design in the sun, because he had never designed in the sun, right? Because he was making buildings in Paris or New York, or, whatever, cold climates, and it was all about heating. So he was like, I'm going to design in the sun. And so he was determined to make the building as a machine, literally as a machine, like a passive machine for shading the building. So that's why also the roof of the main blocks of the courts also comes out at a very angle at the end, right? It's a very serious curve, right? The front of the building.
What does that do in terms of the passive?
Self-shading. It shades the building. It acts as like a head of a snake, and it shades the rest of the facade.
Achha. As opposed to like a linear brise soleil, you think this is more efficient?
This is like doubling up. It also has the brise soleil, but then the brise soleil also curves, so it adds to the shading. So he has the double roof, he has the brise soleil, he has the wind contracting system, and then he has the water collection, which goes down into the scuppers and makes these tanks in the front of the building, which not only reflect the facade of the building and double it, but also, provide a cooling, are supposed to provide a cooling effect. So, William Curtis notes that he was very excited by Pinjore. He went to
the gardens.
Now, the Mughals knew how to make passive solar buildings, right? All their forts, all their structures, all their gardens, and then the, Amber, the Rajasthani people, North and Northeast India knew how to make passive solar buildings because they had no air conditioning. So he was, I think, trying to channel all that technology. But of course, what other thing he was also channeling was the villages. Because I've just been going through, we have to bring in Maristella into this podcast, because Maristella Casciato has just published, what is it called?
Album Punjab?
Album Punjab, yes, the Album Punjab, yes. The very first sketchbook that Corbusier carried with him the very first time he visited India. And in that, you see him nonstop sketching the villages. He's like so excited by the villages. And in the villages, he constantly sketches that the roof goes up. No, the side walls go up. And then the roof slopes at the top slightly or however. And then the drainage is through a scupper as a hole in the wall. In other words, the side elevations of the High Court, which have this, blank wall, and a huge gargoyle or scupper coming through to exit the water. The texture of that wall as sort of the rough concrete and the scupper coming through can directly be traced to Corbusier's sketches of the mud walls of the villages surrounding Chandigarh that he visited for the very first time.
And then he uses that elsewhere as well, I think in the museum and the College of Art.
That's right. So then he just develops it into a way of doing things.
You touched on the doubling of the facade in the pools in front of it. You think he was always aware of what he's doing, not just the cooling effect, but also showing how the plan and the elevation is kind of overlapping?
That's a good question, whether he was aware.
Or like how intentional was it in terms of its effect, of how that contributes to its weightlessness?
If you take the reflecting pools in front of the main facade of the High Court, you can see the elevation reflected in it upside down. So in a sense, the elevation of the High Court becomes the plan, which reverses down and becomes its inverted reflection. So it's symmetrical, but in a horizontal way, right? Now, this is significant because, for sure, for two or three things, the play between plan and elevation, the sort of the game between how a plan works with its elevation and section is something that obsessed Corbusier. He was constantly talking about the relationship between the plan and the elevation and the section. And he said, if you can figure that out, then you are an architect. And that comes straight from Cubism, because in Cubism, you like, if you look at a standard Picasso painting, sort of a caricature of a Picasso painting, he sees the face from the front and then he sees the face from the side. So in other words, from a 90 degrees difference, right?
Right. The breaking of the picture plane.
Breaking of the picture plane, and in other words, it implies movement through 90 degrees, right? And by movement through 90 degrees, he implies space and depth, rather than putting in perspective, which of course, is a distorted image. He's trying to be more objective, modernist in his anti-perspectival. And that also creates, in Corbusier terms, architectural promenade, because he always insists you got to move through a building to know what its architecture is. And that experience of moving through a building is what makes architecture, not like a perfect view or, Versailles kind of a perfect image.
It's very anti-Renaissance. It's rather a engaged observer who's moving through, like in a Japanese garden.
Yes, like in a Japanese garden, or what Baudelaire calls the flaneur. That's true. It's more like a Japanese garden. It has been appropriated, I think, in modernist literature via the 19th century trope of the flaneur in the streets of Paris, but I don't think that that's correct. I mean, there's a Eurocentrism to that analysis. It's more connected to the Japanese garden, or even the Victorian stroll gardens of the late 18th and early 19th century. And the Victorian stroll gardens, what were the Victorian stroll gardens like in England? Anyway, I've forgotten their names, but they were also derived from Japanese and Chinese gardens. So yeah, it's definitely got the sort of body-aware walking character and assembling space and time through the memory mnemonic device, through memory, as the production of architecture within the head kind of idea. So it's that 90 degrees. So Corbusier definitely talks about 90 degrees between the plan and elevation as being a critical thing. But usually in Corbusier, that's a game between the plan, which is supposed to organize program, right? Because you have to distribute the program, and elevation and section, which is more the architect's just designer realm, because he has to sort of produce drama over there, right? And Corbusier, as we will see later in the assembly, you look at the plan and of the assembly building, you can never imagine that it would become the form it is in elevation and section. So that's the normal game. Yeah, I mean, like, you have a certain plan, but it becomes something absolutely different and amazing. It's like the two sides of the face, and then you put them two together and it makes for a magical composition. But as far as I know, the High Court is the only building that I have ever met, ever seen in all my studies in architectural history, Western, non-Western, where the plan is the same as the elevation. In other words, you have to know that the game in architecture is how to bring different plans, elevations, and sections together to make this drama of architecture, to see that when you make plan and elevation the same, you're actually, doing either playing a joke on architecture,
Right.
or doing something astonishing, or both. Yeah. So Corbusier is doing that. Now, you asked whether he was aware that he's playing this joke. Now, I know the relationship between plan and elevation and section is something he's obsessed with. So he could not have missed the fact that they are about the same. And he definitely was obsessed also with the fact that the water in front would reflect the plan. So he knew it would reflect the plan. Now, technically, basically, he said the reflections will double the size of the building. And he talked a lot about that, that's for free. I am doubling your buildings, he used to say.
I see.
Right. because it was a vast plain, and he was very concerned that I'm putting these buildings and there is so much space. My buildings are going to look insignificant. But his opening lines in one of his words, that the making of the capital was an act of occupying a plain. And I wonder what this French for occupying is. One should study the French, what he wrote in the original French, because occupying has a very colonial, owning of land kind of connotation in English. To occupy, right? Occupy somebody else's territory. You occupy Wall Street and so on. You sort of it's possessive. But I wonder what the original French was and what that means. That would be worth interesting. Anyway, all being said, so the doubling of the facade was part of the visual pyrotechnics of occupying the plain. He said, doubled the building just out of nothing. But when you put all this together and it creates this doubling, but in a horizontal direction, it produces horizontal symmetry, as an event. So what do I mean by horizontal symmetry? This is an idea that I first read about in an essay called Mies van der Rohe's Paradoxical Symmetries, which was written by the British architectural historian Robin Evans in the AA Files number 16. I have this memorized because when I read this article, I was just blown away. It's one of the best pieces of architectural writing that I have frankly ever read.
Is it about a specific building?
It's about the Barcelona Pavilion in Barcelona, or the German Pavilion for the 1929 Expo, I think, in Barcelona. Right. And it's this beautiful modernist building, right?
Which also has a pool in the back with the sculpture.
With the school pool in the back, with that nationalist female nude sculpture, which is, very controversial. There's question about whether Mies would have wanted it, but I think he put it there. But the main thing about, Robin Evans says about that building is that when he came back from his visit to the Barcelona Pavilion, and he was looking at his slides. Now, this was in the old days when you had slides. Now, this will give you a great example of the difference between the digital and the ontological, and the non-digital.
Analog.
Analog, yes, thank you. That when Mies van der Rohe was looking at when he started to write his paper on the Barcelona Pavilion, he was looking at his slides, and he constantly found that he was often looking at his slides upside down. And it would always take him like 3-4 seconds to realize that the slide is upside down. And he said, oh my God, this is like, what's going on here? Why am I making this kind of mistake? I mean, I'm not an idiot. I've seen a lot of architecture, and he found out that it was a property of the building, which is that, first of all, the building is about 12 feet high. So the human height falls more or less in the middle. So the amount above your head is the same as amount below from the camera's perspective.
Right.
And then he has put the travertine in the walls also divided exactly around the middle with symmetrical patterns on both sides. So you don't know which side could be up and down. And then normally columns give you some sense because, they have some sense of delivering the weight at the bottom. You should have a base and then you should have a finial. But Mies van der Rohe takes the columns and he clads them in chrome.
And also they're cruciform, aren't they?
They're cruciform, yes. And they're covered in chrome so that they simply reflect their surroundings, right? So in fact, they look like tie members. They look in tension rather than compression.
Right.
And then the ceiling of the building is painted white so that it reflects the floor, right? So the light comes in from the side, it bounces off the shiny floor, and it's not actually reflected, but it has a reflective quality. So because of the way the building is set up, and because of the height at which the eye level falls, he described the building as having horizontal symmetry. And that was for him, because of that experience of these slides, an uncanny experience, okay, where when you're looking at a building and you think you're looking at the building and you're a trained architectural historian, and suddenly you realize you're looking at the building upside down. That's the experience as as the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud describes it, the classic experience of the uncanny. The uncanny is not something frightening that happens to you, that you're walking the street, it's a scary dark night, and then a monster comes out of the dark and startles you. That's just fear or horror. And uncanny is when you think you are in a familiar place, when you think you are in a comfortable place, when you think you are home, and you suddenly realize this is a strange home. That feeling of comfort suddenly transforms into the feeling of discomfort.
Or at least there's an oscillation between the two.
Tension between the two. But for a while you have to feel comfortable, but suddenly it becomes uncomfortable. So Freud describes this through the German word for uncanny is unheimlich, and heimlich, my pronunciation may be wrong, is homely, home feeling.
I see.
So when the home feeling becomes unhomely, that's uncanny. So for instance, Freud also takes, classically describing The Sandman by Hoffman or somebody. This guy falls in love with this woman who he sees through a window, and he's obsessed with her. And then when he one day gets into the house to approach her, he realizes she's a doll. That feeling, oh shit. And, this is the same feeling that Ridley Scott plays with in Blade Runner. Anyway, so this is all uncanny. So he describes, he says horizontal symmetry in architecture is the experience of the uncanny. Now, traditionally, architecture is vertically symmetric. You take any Greek facade or a Hindu temple or any building, it is symmetrical generally about a middle axis, but in a vertical direction, right? And vertical symmetry is very familiar, very comfortable, because in a sense, it reflects the human body standing upright. We stand upright, we are vertically symmetrical, and the building reflects us and magnifies us. So there's a sort of a mirror-like relationship between a vertical symmetry in a building and an upright standing observer or human body. It sort of produces an illusion of one's own self in the building, but at a much more magnificent scale. And this is a traditional psychological purpose of buildings, is to produce grandiosity of yourself.
Right. I think you talked about this in reference to Lacan and the mirror stage.
Yes, that's right. But basically I'm saying is vertical symmetry in a building is common, expected, and normalizing, which is to say it sort of serves a traditional normal function of architecture. But horizontal symmetry is rare and is uncanny and is kind of scary and is very unusual. And the only two buildings exhibiting horizontal symmetry that I know of are Barcelona Pavilion and the High Court in Chandigarh.
Wow. I would never have connected these two, but now I know how they're connected.
Yes. And this is the only building. Go ahead.
Do you think subconsciously people are aware of this, and that's why this seems to be a lot of people's favorite building? And you have it on the cover of your new book also.
Yeah, maybe so. It's an amazing building because, the assembly across the road, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is a gorgeous building, of course, but it's a very standard core building. It's formal pyrotechnics, but the High Court is singular and unique. And it is possible also to read the High Court, because it was his first building, as as a protective structure, because it has a frame all around, and he kind of creates this this sort of enclosed structure, and with this horizontal symmetry and this ability to be able to spin around a horizontal axis, it feels weightless. It feels weightless, and it feels like a defensive building. As if it's unconnected. It's not like visibly connected to sight. Nothing, it doesn't put out arms or shoulders or bases, or, it doesn't reach out. Later on, you look at the governor's palace with the hyperbolic roof at the top, which reaches out to the sky and so on. They connect to the sky. But the High Court doesn't. And one can think of this as Corbusier's first attempt at designing in Chandigarh. And he's like, okay, this is my frame, and I'm going to make a painting within this three-dimensional painting within this frame, and it'll be big, but I don't really know what else to do.
But it's also very revealing. It's like almost he's showing how he's thinking with the symmetry between the plan and what you call a joke. And the plan and the elevation is the same, and then there's the pool to really make it obvious. So he's kind of breaking the fourth wall, it seems, to invite viewers into how his mind works.
Yes, those who can see only those who can see. Corbusier constantly made this reference of eyes that do not see. You've got to work hard to be able to get into a Corbusier building. It's not like postmodern architecture, where it is sort of full of clearly identifiable references. You have to work hard, and it's subtle. And he always said, artists never tell. And, many times I'm a big believer in this, like when I'm teaching studio, and, I tell my students, just go with your gut and do something that is meaningful. And then later on, when you have to present it, you can sort of make up if you want, a story of what you think is the rationale behind the design. Post-rationalized. So post-rationalization can be, a con job also, like whatever, you make up anything about anything. But which is nonsense, sales job, what does the audience want to hear, and you make something out of that. But ex-post rationalization, when you allow your body to think and do the work through its long training, and then you try and deconstruct what your body did, is like dreaming when you're asleep, and then next day really thinking about what the dream was trying to say. So I think Corbusier also worked like that. He intuitively knew what was the right thing to do, and just did it. And then it's our job to sort of produce ex post facto rationalizations, which I think are as much about him, of course, as they are about us or whoever is reading the building.
I mean, maybe that's what makes a good work of art, when it's not obvious what it means, and you're always in a process of discovering things about it. The deeper you go into it, the audience is co-constructing it, as opposed to the architect being like, this is what it is.
That's right. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at what is called a canonical text, like great texts of literature, great texts of literature are great, not because they have a single amazing interpretation, because they afford a multiplicity of readings, because they dwell and explore the ambiguity of being alive. Being alive is not, in the Abrahamic universe, the Judeo-Christian Islamic universe, is a battle between good and evil. It's black versus white. But really, actually, life is mostly in shades of gray. And there are way more than 50 shades. So one last thing to say about the High Court, of course, is that it has those three massive pylons that form the gateway, right? That separate the court of the Chief Justice from the other courts. And those were meant to be like a portal, like a doorway,
Right.
And because that portal has a kind of a pathway in front, and with water bodies on both sides, the reflection doesn't go through the portal. The portal is not reflected.
The portal is the only thing that's disrupting the completing the frame.
That's right. So effectively, that kind of bridge between the two sides of the water tank that goes into the portal is kind of like a ramp in the sky. If the building is kind of floating, it kind of enters the building right in the middle of the reflected frame. So it's a very significant place of entry So he creates the entry as the sort of enter into the middle of something that's surreal, a surreal painting. It was supposed to be the terminus of a walking path from the assembly to the High Court. But the judges, of course, wanted to drive their cars up and put their cars in that area. Because they wanted to come from this side and they wanted the plaintiffs and lawyers to come from the other side of the building to maintain the colonial version of the hierarchy. So Corbusier was really pissed about that, but he lost that battle, and the judges just insisted on, and still insist on, parking the cars in front of the building. And then the other thing, of course, is they told him they only needed 7 or 8 courts in the beginning, but very quickly they needed another, whatever it is, 40, 50 courts. So that's how he designed the addition at the back of the High Court, so that it steps back and recedes down and is never visible from the assembly plaza. So,
right. I think a lot of people don't know about that part of the building, or even think of it as an extension of the High Court, because it's so concealed, so
it's
so out of sight. Yeah,
that's right. Architecturally speaking, it disappears. But of course, that's where most of the work and most of the business happens.
So we haven't spoken yet about the interior of the High Court and how that relates to the exterior and the peculiar things about specifically the High Court and the tapestries at the back of each of the chambers and the furniture that was specially designed for these individual rooms and the confession box and all these things. What is the interplay between the inside and the outside in this case?
Yeah, that's a very good question. What is the interplay between the inside and the outside? To a certain extent, unlike many Corbusian buildings, it doesn't have much of an interplay. It's like the exterior of the building is like a box, empty box. And this is true also of the assembly and the secretariat, where the exterior is like a box which is set up to protect the building inside. The exterior is a sort of a protective brise-soleil system with a double roof, and air condition, a passive air conditioning system. And then there is the interior. And the main thing about the interior is the furniture, I think it was mostly designed by Uli Chowdhury. This needs to be established, but I think it's pretty much true. He okayed it, but according to Uli Chowdhury, she designed it, and then Corbusier said, yeah, this is good, I'll put it in there. And we know mostly that Corbusier did not design furniture. Even the chaise was designed by Charlotte Perriand, the famous Corbusier chaise. So he was not a furniture person, and I don't think he really liked furniture. So I would fully accept that Uli Chowdhury designed the furniture and he just put it in. But the couple of things to know about it is that the orientation of the courts was 90 degrees off, in the sense that judges were facing the direction of the brise soleil on the plaza side. Like their backs were to the east wall.
The tapestries. I mean, yeah.
Where the tapestries are. Yeah, that's right. And behind them were supposed to be the tapestries.
So there's kind of a backdrop for the judges.
Backdrop for the judges with the brise soleil in front. That's how the courts were originally set up. But the judges objected. They said, the witnesses are backlit when we do this.
Oh.
So we can't see their faces. And we can't know whether they're lying or not. So then they changed the orientation of the courts 90 degrees, so that now the judges sit with their backs to the north side, right? In at least the Chief Justice sits that way. I don't know. I think all the courts sit that way. So that's the first thing to know about it. So then Corbusier designed the tapestries behind the judges. So the tapestries basically are paintings, right? Corbusier was into these murals, wall murals, which he had started to design. He'd always been designing. Pavilion Suisse has a huge mural, right? Once you enter the building. The doors of Ronchamp have these, are basically constructed murals. So he wanted to paint the building. And he wanted to put symbolisms about what is equilibrium and balance. So, for instance, he designed the symbol for the High Court as an asymmetrically balanced scale, right? Now, traditionally,
Right,
the
right.
symbol of a court is a blindfolded woman holding up the scales of justice, tarazu.
Mhm.
But and they're, she's supposed to be equal to both sides. And Corbusier says, well, that is true, but there are many ways of balancing depending on the size. So you got to balance out the big against the small. So then he designed the tapestries to sort of illustrate balance, but in a complex way, right? Again, balance not as you draw a line through the middle and do the same things on both sides, not vertically symmetrical, but in a rich, complex way so that it actually circulates movement all around. So that's what the tapestries are about. They sort of illustrate balance in composition. So if you can study the tapestry of the Chief Justice's Court, which is the most famous, you can see elements on one side being balanced out by the other side. So basically, the way I read it, the tapestries are magnifications, elaborations, complexifications of the world of balancing, where the external scales outside the High Court as the symbol of justice is outside. So he's talking about balance in a very different way. So that's an important thing. But then, of course, they had to be made, and he wanted to make them as tapestries. I don't exactly know the story of why and how he decided to make these as tapestries. And I think it has to do with the dharis. He saw in the Punjabi households dharis. The dharis were placed everywhere, which is basically rough knot. They're not carpets. Carpets are very fine knots and are sort of catered to winter. They're very warm. But he saw that the dhari functioned also as a cooling device because it was big knots and allowed for a lot of ventilation, right, while providing a certain amount of shade. So dharis is a sort of a Punjabi technology, right?
Right.
So he saw the dharis and he saw them functioning. And I think, therefore, then he decided to try and get the tapestries made as massive dharis because he was very interested in handwork. So he constantly talked about how the rough concrete was rough poured because it was an embodiment of a hand poured concrete, because all the concrete in Chandigarh is hand poured. Whereas at the same time, he was designing the Carpenter Center in New York, not in New York, in Cambridge.
Cambridge.
For Harvard. There, the concrete is machine poured, and it's fine. It's silky smooth. Whereas the concrete finish in Chandigarh is rough. And he said this is because it's hand poured. And he wanted, therefore, it to be preserved, that presence of the hand. So the making of the dharis was also a representation, not a sort of a presentation of what the hand does. I think he tried to figure out, and I think P.L. Verma is the person who helped him, though I'm not 100% sure. He figured out where the dharis are made, somewhere close to Amritsar. Somewhere in the Amritsar Firozpur area is where they were made. But I think somebody else, others may, Deepika Gandhi or somebody else may know more about it. Kiran Joshi might. And so he made basically these paintings on balance and harmony, and then had them converted into dharis, which were supposed to be behind the judges, but being dharis, but not placed on the ground, but on vertical surfaces. I think they were also expected to contribute to the passive solar cooling of the building.
And also the acoustically it'll sort of contain the sound.
That's right. Of course, that was a key and important function, that they would have acoustic properties, that they would absorb the sound. Yes. That's right. And again, he was very pissed off because at a certain point, the judges decided, in spite of all this passive solar systems, they wanted air conditioning.
That was while Corbusier was alive, the air conditioning.
While air conditioning was installed.
But they would probably not cut out until after he died, right?
No, that was in front of him, and he sort of okayed it or something. I mean, this was an interesting thing about Corbusier is he was obsessive and he put a lot of effort into design. But sort of once the building was done, he kind of said whatever. He did wash his hands. Contrary to personality, he was not obsessive. He designed the entire governor's palace. It's tour de force, right? And Nehruji said, no, we don't need a governor's palace. And he just said, okay, and moved on. It's an astonishing thing because it's a gorgeous building.
And then they scaled it, and then they changed the whole building. When
We'll talk about all that when we come to the governor's palace.
But yeah, that
complicated.
does
But
seem
that-
contrary to what he looks like. I mean, from the outside, it looks like he would be
Yeah.
a perfectionist and very dogmatic about what should be done or how it should be done. But
Yeah.
it seems to be very flexible.
Yeah, I buy kind of once Tony Vidler told me this theory about all this is that, it's so difficult to put your ideas into architecture because, there are so many people involved and so much money riding on it and so much, of people's expectations on a building. So Corbusier was extremely, like many architects, extremely insistent on the way a building is to be because he knew that the winds of resistance would come in his face, no matter where or what the project. So the more he held firm to what he wanted, the more he felt he could get what he made. And in the end, if he got 90% of 80% of what he wanted made, he was actually very happy with that. But he knew that if he started to give what he wanted would become 50%, 40%, and then that would be no good. He wanted to hit 80%, 90%. And then once the building was done, he tried to design buildings that could withstand their inevitable deterioration, or if you want, transformations through time. He knew that was going to happen.
Yeah.
But he tried to design, tough buildings.
Right. Resilient. I think we've talked about the plaza in this sense of how it's incomplete intentionally, but that seems to be present in the buildings also. They have room for accommodation for future exigencies and changes in program requirements and such. And you see so many instances of that in this building alone.
Right. Right.
And also, I think a couple of things we haven't talked about yet is outside the lower courts, there's a sunshade that was added.
Yes.
Right afterwards to protect the people waiting from the sun, and how the pylons below the arches were painted afterwards.
Yes,
they were
that's right.
Initially white.
They were initially white, and then and then Corbusier painted them. And I think he must have orally given instructions to Pierre Gendry of what colors he wanted. And then when he came and saw the colors that were painted, he hated them. And then he had them repainted, I think, to the colors he wanted. And he had a big fight with Pierre, about, the colors. He said, you knew the colors that I wanted, so on and so forth.
Hard to imagine them now without the colors. Such a big part of the building's character.
That's right. It would look like a bloodless building as a cadaver, like a dead body, with all the blood drawn out, I think, with the concrete and white. It would look lifeless.
That does mirror the enamel door of the assembly, because that's also on the facade of the assembly, the only bit of color that's there.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Well, that was a Corbusier technique. He'd make buildings monochrome or concrete or whatever, and then he would put in splashes of color. It was a very high modernist technique, like you put in the doors or you add in the paintings within a frame, and they're like highly colored.
Right, skylights in La Tourette.
Well, skylights in La Tourette is also an example, yes. So that color was very specifically, in particular ways, put in.
Wait, what happens when you go up the ramp? Are there rooms above the courts, or does that ramp lead straight away to the terrace and to the extension?
Well, the ramp essentially is designed to give access to all the administrative rooms that are stacked up at normal, 10 feet. Like the courts are multi-story, right? Like they're 40 feet tall or something like that. So behind them are the offices of the clerks who recorded and give all the judgments. And the ramps give access to floors of those rooms. And then they reach the roof. So that's what the ramp does. But the ramp is your classic architectural promenade. and mirrors the ramp in the Villa Savoie, where it is positioned directly behind the pylons, right? So the idea is that as you're going up the ramp, you're viewing the Capitol complex through the pylons, and you're gaining height and seeing how the view changes as you go up and down. That's how it's designed to work.
Yeah, that does seem like one of the more iconic views of the Capitol, like the assembly and the secretariat through the pylons of the High Court.
So that
above
was
the ramp.
self-consciously
Intentional.
constructed, no question about it. Yeah.
I think when we were last there many years ago, you referred to the Capitol complex as a surreal modernist landscape.
Surreal. I wonder why I called it surreal. Yeah.
Maybe that sense of the uncanny.
Yeah, maybe the sense of the uncanny. But there must also be a reason in the way that it's frightening and surreal in that sense. Yeah. Whether it's Dali-esque.
This is pretty alien architecture,
Yeah.
It's very unlike the rest of Chandigarh or the rest of the world.
Yes. It is unlike the rest of the world. And it's certainly very unlike, the buildings that it is most compared to, the Mill Owners Association building in Ahmedabad and the Carpenter Center in Cambridge. Both those buildings, by comparison, gorgeous, formal, essays. Those are sculptures. Whereas the Chandigarh buildings are sculptures, but they also have complex, deep, surreal, uncanny aesthetic imagery. They are much more complex buildings. And the stakes were so much higher in Chandigarh, right? I mean, the Carpenter Center is just an academic building. And the Mill Owners Association building is, a private building, essentially, for meeting hall.
Yeah.
Whereas here, Corbusier was dealing with the institutions of state, aspirational institutions of state. The Nehruvian vision was very aspirational and futuristic, preparing for unknown futures to come.
It's like it's charged with meaning.
Yeah, and therefore emotion.
Thanks for listening to The Story of Chandigarh. This is your host and producer, Ishan Chofla. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can email us at storyofchandigarh@gmail.com. We'll continue our conversation in the next episode. Until then, this is The Story of Chandigarh.